Thank you, Rachel. Good morning, everyone. Well, let me begin by stating the obvious. This is not the metaverse session. Today, we're not going to talk about your limbless avatar in cyberspace. We're actually going to talk about perhaps the single most precious asset class there is, which is resilient geography. And that's what, as Rachel alluded to, the COP process is reminding us every day as we overshoot those emissions targets, as climate change accelerates faster than we predicted. We're starting to realize that we have to do a much better job in quantifying and pricing geography and the future of resilient geography. That's what we do at Climate Alpha. But I'm going to back up for a minute and remind everyone, since you're here, those of you who are not based in Asia, maybe you're visiting Asia, there's a particular phenomenon that is occurring, which is complexity, right? Complexity, feedback loops, in which really the various parts of our system, the various functional domains, whether it is economics, politics, technology, and so forth, but also geographies, are colliding in complex ways that we have a very hard time deciphering. And I give you an example of Asia. So here we are, a region, the fastest growing region of the world economically, that represents 50% of the global population, more than 50% of GDP, whose incremental growth, whose breakneck growth over the last couple of generations has been a very significant contributor to the acceleration of climate change, particularly through greenhouse gas emissions, industrialization, and so forth. So what we have now is a situation where the region of the world that is in many ways the driver, the engine of global economic growth, is also the region that is accelerating climate change the fastest and also has the greatest exposure to climate change. Here in this cartogram, you see the greenhouse gas emissions produced by Asia, the number of people in Asia who are vulnerable to natural disasters, whether it's flooding, drought, rising sea levels, for example, and so forth. And therefore, you can actually say that the rise of Asia is leading to the sinking of Asia. And that's complexity at work over a long time frame. This raises, of course, the fundamental question, this dichotomy between mitigation and adaptation. What are we doing to adapt? And I'm going to spend some time, more time, on the adaptation side, whereas the COP process is more about the mitigation side. So let's step back for a minute. Previously, I showed you a cartogram of the overweight population of Asia and the impact climate change is having on it. Let's pan back to the global level and look at what climate change may, the impact it may have globally. This is a map, again, demographics. This is a pixelated map of the world population, so you would say this is kind of human geography in its rawest form. So on this map, you have 8 billion pixels. Well, conveniently, the United Nations has declared that next week, this week, the United Nations is declaring that the world population has reached 8 billion people. So here we are. Every human being is a pixel on this map. Now look closely. This is called the suitability index, right? This is the change in the suitability for human habitation of different geographies relative to their previous condition as temperatures rise, 1 degree, 2 degrees into the future. Again, as we know from all of the official statements coming out of COP and elsewhere, we're not likely to prevent an average 2-degree Celsius temperature rise. And of course, because in different latitudes of the world, in different microclimates and regions, climate change proceeds at a different pace, you have some parts of the world that are already quite evolved in that direction anyway. If you remember the heat waves that afflicted South Asia earlier this year, what you really saw was just a big red peninsula of South Asia. Well, that wasn't 2040. That wasn't a 2050 forecast, the likes of which you see coming out of official reports. That was actually this year. And the heat waves that have led to heat stroke and higher and elevated mortality rates, even in the northern latitudes, are really quite striking. It's a reminder, again, of the relative rather than absolute impact that climate change is having around the world. Now, the particular irony that we face is that most of the human population, as you saw on the previous slide, are located in areas that are becoming more and more red, that are becoming more and more unlivable over time. Not only is it most of the world population that's in those red, increasingly red zones, it's most of the world's young people as well. So literally the future of our species, the future of our demography is trapped in the wrong places. And COP, as far as I can tell, is not giving us a roadmap for that. At COP, they're debating reparations, loss damage funds, and these kinds of things, not actually solving the fundamental problem. And so we're in a situation where, for those of you who are in finance, familiar with this terminology, people are talking about a climate Minsky moment, right? Asset prices are likely to correct in an unpredictable moment in time and collapse drastically. And the sector that is perhaps the most exposed is real estate, right? Land, property. This is the largest asset class that exists in the global economy, and we simply taken it for granted, right? Anywhere from some estimates, 250 to 300 trillion dollars of property assets in the world, and really it's very hard to know what the value of those is going to be tomorrow, let alone 5 years from now, 10 years from now, right? We have risk-adjusted valuations for equities and other financial products, but not really for this fundamental geography of our real estate. And that's something that has to be corrected. Now, this is where the divide between mitigation and adaptation comes in. When it comes to mitigation, again, this is what the international diplomatic process is all about. It's about saying, how do we decarbonize our industries, green our supply chains, reduce emissions, even undertake geoengineering schemes. I support all of that. And those measures are getting about 90% of the total global expenditure to combat climate change. Only about 10% or less is actually going to adaptation, which is what do we do today, right now, to survive, to support populations, societies in need, and to retrofit our infrastructure, our built environment, our habitats. I think that is gravely imbalanced, given the impact that climate change is already having on life expectancy, on productivity, and so forth. Now, when it comes to that physical risk dynamic, we're getting better at calculating the value at risk, but again, we're not committing enough resources to actually staving it off, to mitigating that impact. But really, for every single climate hazard there is, whether it is storm, flood, drought, heat wave, sea level rise, and so forth, there are adaptation measures that can be undertaken physically that we should be investing a lot more capital in. And that in and of itself, climate adaptation is a suite of investments, of technologies that deserves a lot more attention. Again, in finance right now, we're focused on really the compliance side of things, right? How do we measure our greenhouse gas emissions? How do we report on our climate exposure? How do we track Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions through our buildings, our supply chains, and so forth? That's all fine, but to report on something is not to actually do something about it, right? And as climate change accelerates, simply capturing what we're attempting to do in the mitigation space does not necessarily mean that you're investing sufficiently in adaptation. So, we heard the term ESG a lot earlier. I have a particular way of interpreting that acronym. The way I see it, climate change has in many ways left the station, right? I do, again, support each and every measure that we're taking to reduce emissions. But I'm also, as a humanitarian, as a utilitarian, very much concerned with the actual suffering and damage that is being wrought upon many of our geographies today in countries rich and poor. You could be in Fort Myers, Florida, and have been uninsured, had your home not insured, and you've lost everything. Or, of course, you could be a victim of a flood in Pakistan. The fact is that you should not be building back where you built before, right? You should escape shitty geography. And quite frankly, it is I think our moral, it's a moral requirement, and it's a moral agenda that I support, that we actually support the adaptation of populations to relocate to resilient geographies. We have plenty of it. As someone who's trained in geography, I will tell you that we have 150 million square kilometers of terrain on this planet, and we have, as I mentioned earlier, only 8 billion people. There's plenty of space for people to live, right? But we're not adapting our political, economic systems, our business models, our infrastructure accordingly, and we very well should. I will say that there has been something of an evolution psychologically, mentally, in many countries as they realize just how rapidly climate change is evolving. If you recall, perhaps some of these names might be familiar to you. Certainly if you're American, you'll remember Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, Hurricane Sandy in New York, and now Hurricane Ian that just hit Florida. Well, over the arc of the last 15 years, there has been this maturity in which people used to say, build back better, Let's go back. We're going to rebuild. Of course we are, right? Well, I don't hear people saying that as much in South Florida, right? They're saying, actually, time to move on. Insurance is not going to underwrite further investments. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is going to declare declare eminent domain and prevent people from actually moving back to live there. The Army Corps of Engineers is not recommending that the federal government make investments in those geographies. So again, there is a learning process underway, and that applies as much to America as to everywhere in the world, where they're realizing that, quite frankly, this is a biological issue. We are mammals. We are imbued with a fight or flight instinct. You do not fight nature, right? You flee, right? And that's probably the sensible thing to do. Well, right now, if you take a country like the United States, over the last 100 years, the percentage of the population in the South and the West has grown directly at the expense of the populations in the North and the East. And that's not what climate models tell you should be happening, obviously, as you look in the future. But a lot of this movement has been in a kind of pre-climate change sort of context. And of course, people vote with their feet, not so much historically on the basis of climate change, because it has not been as present in their calculations, but rather on the basis of sunshine, low taxes, and other kinds of things. But that is obviously going to change. And that's something that we have to start to price in, plan for, and even encourage if we want to live in productive societies rather than survivalist societies where people continue to remain in climate-stressed areas and believe that they can actually just tough it out. You are not a productive economic agent or an active contributor to society if you're simply just rebuilding in places that are going to keep getting devastated. That's not sensible. But the way the policy-making environment is today pretty much gets it backwards, right? In legislative processes in democratic societies, at the local level, you fight over getting local spoils to spend on your priorities at a local level with very little regard to whether or not that is a climate resilient geography that's going to be a long-term asset to the national economy or not. And of course, I appreciate that that's the way democratic politics works. But when you're making 30, 40, 50-year investments on infrastructure, housing, and other kinds of public goods, you do have to actually start with the climate models rather than ignoring them. So I would pretty much flip the sequence of how we do fiscal policy and national infrastructure planning on its head. You start with the climate models, and they tell you where are the more or less livable geographies. In areas with large populations that are stressed, you invest more in adaptation. So you start with the climate model, then you think about how you allocate and prioritize your long-term multi-generational infrastructure spending. And then, because you have pre-designed, pre-built, built sufficient housing, quality infrastructure, things whether it's water desalination, seawalls, irrigation, whatever the case may be, then you can encourage people to relocate to those climate resilient areas because you will actually have the capacity, right? You won't hopefully have the kind of climate gentrification or scramble that many places are experiencing right now. This is the logical, sensible, long-term oriented sequence of investment and strategy that should be undertaken. Now, it's hard enough to do this in a single country. In fact, I can't name a country that is A, climate stressed, but B, undertaking this kind of logical, rational, long-term thinking at the same time. Well, Singapore would be one, but it's a very small exception to the rule, obviously. And yet at the global level, you can clearly see that if you take a 10,000-year view, even a 100,000-year view, human beings migrate. We're a migratory species, right? To move is human. And yet we don't think about what are the future civilizational centers in light of rapidly accelerating climate change that we need to think about pre-designing, expanding the capacity, improving the infrastructure, developing resilient communities in those places to absorb larger populations over time. But we need to, because it's not a matter of crystal ball gazing to identify what those locations are. I've spent the last 25 years of my life traveling to a lot of the places that are on this map and elsewhere and profiling these geographies, not just for their climate resilience, but also for their politics, their economic models, their capacity to adapt to climate change and other shocks and disruptions. And it's not only the places that are here that are my little stylized yellow stars, but many places, in fact, that can actually harness and absorb growing populations over time. And I've spelled them out in some detail. Now, what are we looking for? What does adaptation look like? What kind of environment, what kind of habitats and settlements should we actually be constructing? Well, this goes, again, back down to fundamental human nature. What are the things that we actually need, right? Well, we can't survive without fresh water supply, for example. This is why humans live where we do already right now, right? Mostly to a large degree driven by the last 12,000 years of latitudes and geographies with stable climate patterns and conditions. So we need fresh water supply. We want to increasingly compress our supply chains, right? We want local water, local food production, local energy supplies, those kinds of things. We want places where there's healthcare, where we can enjoy clean air, longevity, and so forth. And we obviously want to be able to live in stable communities that are open to those growing populations. And it needs to be affordable. Climate change is actually not the biggest or not the most universal crisis in the world. There are places that aren't yet affected by it. But it's hard to think of a place that doesn't have affordable housing as a crisis, right? Which is why you're increasingly seeing that 3D printed housing and other kinds of technological solutions to expanding housing supply are being undertaken, because actually just affordable housing alone is one of our main fiscal crises around the world. So a brief word, coming back to the beginning, on what we're doing about this at Climate Alpha. Climate modeling is not a linear issue, as I said before. I started out by saying that we live in a complex system, and we're not very good at looking at how the different threads affect each other. So the first thing to understand about what we do is that we collect wide data. We don't just look at climate models in a deterministic way. We look at socioeconomic data, we look at real estate transactions, and climate models, and we blend them together to try and understand how these patterns are unfolding in different locations. We use machine learning to parse this data and to generate forecasts depending on different climate scenarios. And scenario planning is really key because we don't really know what the trajectory of climate change will be globally, and we don't necessarily know how it will play out locally. It depends on so many other intervening variables, many of which are actually in our control. Now, so we do three things. One is risk-adjusted valuations on assets. As I mentioned before, knowing your value at risk is pretty easy. If you have assets in a climate-stressed area, then eventually that full value is at risk. But your risk-adjusted valuation is much more complicated because it depends on what adaptation measures you actually undertake in that location and what impact that has on demand. We create indices that help to actually track the extent to which those locations are making the kinds of resilience investments that make them more attractive and livable over time. And the ultimate goal is, as I said before, to steer investment into resilient geography for the betterment of everyone. Now, right now at the moment, we do that for the United States, we do that for Canada, but the goal is to do it for the whole world. The easiest data to get now is actually the climate models, interestingly enough, because it is free. It is done through satellites, geospatial technologies, and so forth, and that's a good thing. So we have these models, we have this knowledge, we have this foresight. The question that I will close with is, what are we doing with it? Right? Are we using it to help us guide the realignment of our geographies? And so I leave you with this phrase, programmable geography. We live in a world of massive misalignments, right? The location of people, as I showed you before, the location of borders, the location of resources, and the location of infrastructure are completely out of sync on the planet. And neither COP nor the Biden administration or anyone is going to tell us how we as a species, as civilization, untangle that, how we realign our geographies. So what I've done is to put on one map for you the geography of resources, the geography of people, the geography of infrastructure, the geography of borders, and say, this is our mission. Right? We have to realign this. We have to adapt and commit as much resources to adaptation as we are to mitigation. In the end, I put two tasks before you and ask you if you are actually contributing to one of these two agendas. You are either moving people to where the resources are, or you're moving technologies to the people who need them. That's it. When you wake up in the morning, ask yourself, are you doing one of those two things? Are you moving people to resources or technologies to people? And that is fundamentally how we are going to adapt to climate change and many other disruptions. So reprogramming our geography is the solution to the challenge of not knowing the value of the geography of tomorrow. Thank you very much.